Welcome to this explainer. We are jumping straight into a massive, frankly fascinating historical journey today. We're mapping out over 2,600 years of incredibly dense history. The goal? To trace the deep roots of the Jewish people through empires, exiles, and migrations, so we can fundamentally understand how the map of the Middle East got to look the way it does today.
Because really, it all points back to this single monumental question: how did this conflict begin? You know, about a century ago, a dispute ignited that would become one of the most complex in the entire world. At its absolute core, it's a conflict between two very different peoples claiming the exact same territory. But to actually grasp the origins of this reality, we can't just look at the 20th century. We've got to rewind the clock way back.
Okay, so here is our roadmap to cover literally millennia of events. We'll hit 1. Ancient kingdoms and exiles, 2. Hellenic and Roman rule, 3. The medieval diaspora, 4. Havens and hostilities, and finally, 5. The dawn of Zionism. Let's dive in.
Starting with Part 1, Ancient Kingdoms and Exiles. The first dispersions. Picture this. It's 750 BC. The Near East is precariously wedged right between two massive superpowers, the Assyrian Empire up north and Egypt down south. Stability? Yeah, that was exceptionally rare here. We see this rapid-fire succession of empires taking control. In 722 BC, the Assyrians take Samaria, forcing people to flee south to Jerusalem. Then the Babylonians roll in. Around 586 BC, Jerusalem rebels, and the Babylonians essentially destroy the city, forcing a massive forced relocation of the population to Babylon. But hold on, because just a few decades later, in 539 BC, the geopolitical map completely flips again when the Persian Empire conquers Babylon.
Now, what is incredibly fascinating here is how a shift in imperial power directly shaped cultural history. The new Persian king actually authorizes free passage for the exiled Judeans. This prompts a massive return to Jerusalem. This era of relative peace, it was absolutely crucial. It gave the Jewish people the breathing room they needed to organize their cultural foundations. They rebuild the city, construct the Temple of Solomon, and the Torah is written.
Moving in to Part 2, Hellenic and Roman rule, friction and revolt.
Fast forward to 334 BC. Alexander the Great conquers the known world, but when he dies, his massive empire fractures into these competing Hellenistic kingdoms. And this split creates totally different realities. Down in Egypt under the Ptolemaic dynasty, you see real cultural blending. A community settles in Alexandria and actually translates the Torah into Greek. But contrast that with the Seleucid dynasty. Here, severe cultural friction just boils over. It gets so bad that an altar to Zeus is placed right inside the Temple of Jerusalem. Obviously, this provokes a massive, violent pushback. An anti-Hellenic traditionalist militia takes control in 164 BC, and they briefly establish an independent kingdom of Judea.
But as we see so often in history, that independence doesn't last. The Roman army marches in, and the Judeans fiercely resist, with two major, devastating revolts. The first revolt in 66 AD leads to the brutal siege of Jerusalem and the total destruction of the temple. Literally only the Wailing Wall survives. The second revolt is met with even more brutality. The city is completely razed. And crucially, the Romans forbid Jews safe passage back to Judea. This Roman retaliation permanently alters the geographic distribution of the Jewish people, sparking this widespread migration all across the empire.
Which brings us to Part 3, the medieval diaspora, expansion and persecution.
So, the Roman Empire eventually declines, Christianity becomes the dominant religion, and new powers emerge. And the treatment of Jewish communities during this time, it is a wild pendulum swing depending on where you look and who is in charge. Following the 7th century Arab conquests, Jewish populations are largely tolerated. Over in the Iberian Peninsula, in Al-Andalus, Jews make up 5% of the population, ushering in an incredible golden age of culture. But then, look at 11th century Europe. Central Asian Turks start blocking Christian pilgrimages to Jerusalem, which sparks the Crusades. And as European Christians march toward the Holy City, they completely massacre Jewish communities along the way, falsely accusing them of being a D-side people, meaning blaming them for the death of Jesus Christ.
And things in Europe deteriorate even further during one of history's absolute darkest chapters. In 1347, Genoese merchant boats inadvertently spread the Black Death. This plague kills nearly half of Europe. But this unfathomable tragedy is heavily compounded for the Jewish people. Baseless rumors start spreading, accusing them of poisoning the wells. This leads to horrific persecution, especially along the Rhine and Rhone rivers, and massive expulsions.
This all happens right around the end of the Spanish Reconquista, where Catholic kings are issuing ultimatums to either convert or leave. As a result, the vast majority of the displaced Jewish population desperately migrates toward the much more welcoming borders of the Ottoman Empire.
Let's look at Part 4, Havens and Hostilities, the Eastern European Shift.
So, while many fled to the Ottoman Empire, another major haven opens up in Eastern Europe. The Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth sets up favorable migration policies, drawing in those desperately fleeing persecution. And the demographic shift is staggering: 300,000. By the 17th century, this single region hosts over 300,000 Jews. To put that into perspective, that's roughly half of the entire global Jewish population at the time.
But tragically, we have to follow that up with a heartbreaking counterpoint: 100,000. In 1648, Ukrainian peasants, known as the Cossacks, violently revolt against the nobility. And they target the Jewish population too, accusing them of having privileged relationships with the people in power. During this brutal uprising, more than 100,000 Jewish people are either killed or forced to flee all over again.
That Cossack revolt severely weakens the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Over the next 150 years, the territory gets carved up by neighboring powers. Suddenly, about 900,000 Jews find themselves living within the borders of the Russian Empire, and they were decidedly not welcome. This is where we really have to define this crucial term, pogrom. It's a Russian word literally meaning devastation. It refers to the frequent, deadly, and targeted attacks on Jewish communities that local authorities would just routinely ignore and leave unpunished. It made life under the Russian Empire a horrific daily reality.
Which brings us to our final era, Part 5, the dawn of Zionism, redrawing the map. Faced with these devastating, relentless pogroms, many Jews naturally emigrate to Western Europe and the United States, where conditions are a bit better. And this late 19th century immigration climate really sets the stage for a brand new political movement. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress is held in Basel, Switzerland. For the very first time, this movement formalizes the contemplation of founding a new, permanent homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. But there's a major roadblock. This territory is tightly controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and they are fiercely opposed to the project. Then, just a few years later, the entire global order is thrown into chaos. World War I breaks out. The balance of power totally shifts. The Ottoman Empire aligns with Germany, and the Allied forces, they are struggling. They are desperately seeking support from any group they can find. So in this incredibly high-stakes, frantic environment, European powers actually start preparing to carve up and redraw the map of the Middle East in the event they win. And to secure that desperately needed wartime support, the British engage in a series of parallel, totally conflicting promises. Neutrally, here's what happens. First, the British Minister of Foreign Affairs pens the Balfour Declaration. It's an open letter promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine in exchange for Jewish support during the war. But at the exact same time, the British are supporting the Arab rebellion against the Ottomans. Their promise? Independence for the Arabs in those exact same liberated territories in exchange for their military rebellion.
So when the dust of World War I finally settles, the European powers actually make good on redrawing the map. The Middle East gets divided up, and Palestine officially comes under the British mandate. And here is the turning point. With two completely different peoples having been promised rights to the exact same land by the exact same empire, this moment directly ignites the modern conflict over this territory.
Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative question. How do these millennia of empires, forced migrations, shifting havens, and parallel political promises shape the deeply complex conflict we see today? You really can't untangle the present without first mapping the past. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope this structured look at the historical sources leaves you curious to explore how this incredibly deep, layered history continues to unfold right into the modern era.